I'm ready. Yep. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this morning's Beaver Fever webinar. Thank you all for attending. It's great to see such a range of people in the audience, experts and enthusiasm who are here today. This webinar is part of a series of webinars introducing you to the Green Minds. It's led by Plymouth City Council in partnership with Real Ideas, the University of Plymouth, Devon Wildlife Trust, the National Trust, Plymouth College of Arts and the Data Place. It's funded by the European Regional Development Fund under the Urban Innovations Actions Programme. I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Chris Avent. I work in the Plymouth City Council Environmental Planning Service, and I'm being supported today by some of my colleagues. Ray Griffiths will be going to Elliott from Devon Wildlife Trust in due course. For those who aren't able to attend. There'll be one speaker and a presentation followed by a Q&A session. And please post any questions that you have in the Q&A function in part of the webinar. So Green Minds aims to put nature at the heart of our decision making, recognising its role in shaping a healthy future for all of us. This means fundamentally challenging our existing attitudes and behaviours towards nature, how we think about it, how we engage with it, and how we work with it. Green Minds invites us to rewild people and places across Plymouth. In August, the government made the momentous decision that the beavers living wild on the River Otter will be permitted to remain and spread naturally. This followed the successful conclusion to the five-year River Otter beaver trial that was conducted under a licence granted to Devon Wildlife Trust. The Plymouth Beaver Project is the first urban beaver reintroduction in the UK and is a milestone in work that has been ongoing for 3 years in the city. This has been led by the City Council in partnership with a project board that involves national and local experts, including not only Devon Wildlife Trust, but also the Universities of Exeter and Plymouth, Derek Gow Consultancy and the Environmental Agency. This group of experts has been instrumental in shaping and supporting the plans for the Plymouth Beaver Project, and it's fantastic to welcome Mark Elliott, who's the Devon Beaver Project lead at Devon Wildlife Trust this morning. Mark will share his overview of the first reintroduction of a formerly resident mammal back into the English countryside. As well as presenting the findings of the River Otter trial and the Devon Wildlife Trust enclosed beaver project at the Upper Tamar, he will discuss the first urban UK beaver reintroduction programme at Derriford Community Park in Plymouth. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you very much, Chris. Hopefully everyone can hear me. I'm going to share my screen now, and so that should bring the presentation up. So thank you for that introduction, Chris. I'm going to kick off straight away with an introduction to this rather charismatic species. So beavers are native to Britain. They were driven extinct about 400 years ago, primarily hunted for their meat and for their fur, and also for their castoreum, because they're feeding on willow bark. They have this salicylic acid in the castoreum, and that was widely used as a tonic and as a perfume. They're a rodent, so they're the world's second largest rodent after the capybara in South America. They're a big animal, over 1 metre in length, and some of the animals that we're dealing with on the River Otter are up to 30 kilograms in weight. So they're a really, really large animal. But as you can see from this this video, they've got some little kits which are born in May, and they have an average of 3 kits in a litter, sometimes as many as 5 or even 6, but 3 is a fairly good, healthy average. And they stay with the parents for 2 years. So they're in the family group, and sometimes that family group, because it's made up of 2 generations, can have as many as sort of 8, 9 animals in it, all living in a lodge. They're an animal that is mostly nocturnal. We do see them a little bit in the summer evenings in daylight, but most of the year they're nocturnal. And they're also very dependent on water. So we call them a semi-aquatic mammal. So they really live close to or within water. And although they have burrows or lodges in the riverbanks or in wetlands that they've created, they spend a huge amount of their time actually in the water itself. They're a vegetarian animal. There's quite a lot of myths about beavers, particularly beavers that eat fish, partly due to the Mr. and Mrs. Beaver in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, who ate fish pie. But as you can see from this, they're a vegetarian animal. In the summer, they're just feeding on these riverside plants. This is fool's watercress, I think they're feeding on here, but a whole range of different wetland species that they like to eat. In the winter months, their diet switches a bit more to the woody materials, so young willow shoots and that sort of thing, and they'll strip the bark off trees, and they'll fell trees in order to reach the upper branches. But yeah, entirely vegetarian diet. And as Chris mentioned, in the next few weeks, we are bringing a pair of beavers, or a family group of beavers, down from Scotland to go into the enclosure at Poole Farm. Now, beavers living in enclosures is not new. We've been running the enclosed beaver project in the Tamar catchment in West Devon since March 2011, and we had a pair of beavers breeding in there ever since we introduced them, and it's been a site where we've done a huge amount of science and monitoring, and I'll talk about some of the work that we've done there over the course of this presentation. But the main focus of today's talk is going to be on the River Otter beaver trial, which is the 5-year licensed wild release of beavers into the River Otter in East Devon. And the trial covered the entire River Otter catchment, so the beavers were free to roam anywhere within the catchment, but the license conditions did require them to stay in the catchment. So if they moved into any adjacent catchments, then we had to go and retrieve them, and that did happen on one occasion. And the science and evidence work that was carried out as part of that trial was overseen by Professor Richard Brazier from the University of Exeter, who's now one of the world's leading beaver experts, and does a lot of the science behind a lot of the projects around the country. And the Science and Evidence Forum published their final report in January of this year, and that's available online, and you can get a link to that via our website or the University of Exeter's website, and that's well worth a good look through. But I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the findings of that over the course of this presentation. The other document that was published as part of the River Otter trial was the management strategy framework, and the idea of that was that it would demonstrate how we would manage the beavers and their impacts over the next 10 years in the event that they were permitted to remain. And again, I'll talk a little bit about that as we go through the presentation. But the decision, as Chris mentioned, was made in August that the River Otter beavers were allowed to remain in perpetuity, and that they would be allowed to spread naturally from the River Otter catchment. And that really marked the first reintroduction of a native mammal back into the English landscape ever. So it's a really groundbreaking decision, and for a species that is such a keystone species, you know, it's such an important part of our ecosystems. So it really was a very significant decision for the landscape in Britain. So a little bit about the trial then. At the beginning of the trial, the beavers were health screened, so they were rounded up by DEFRA. There was a small population of beavers living wild on the River Otter, and that's what triggered the original trial to begin. But because there was some concern about where they'd come from, they needed to be health screened and checked for a parasite called echinococcus, which we don't have in this country, and government vets were concerned that the beavers might have brought it in with them. So part of the initial work was to round up the beavers and to give them a thorough health screening, and over the course of the trial, the animals were occasionally blood tested and given other sort of visual health checks, and they were really carefully monitored and all found to be healthy and really thriving on the River Otter. There were no significant risks to human, livestock or other wildlife health identified throughout the trial, so that's an important finding from the work. The beavers themselves are actually very difficult to monitor because they're an aquatic animal. They are very wide-ranging, and they don't really wear radio tracking devices very well. And so we decided against any sort of radio tracking. So we used field signs. We used beaver feeding signs as the main way of understanding where in the catchment they were living. And every winter we would do a survey of where these feeding signs were and produce these heat maps. And so at the beginning of the trial, this is the area where the beavers were mostly living. So you can see there's a real focus of activity in this area. So just to give you your bearings, for those of you that know the catchment, Otter St Mary is here, Otterton is down here, Honiton is about here, and the river goes all the way up into the Blackdown Hills to Otterhead Lakes, which are actually just into Somerset. And so this is what the population looked like at the start of the trial. The beavers were living in the deeper water, down in the lower part of the catchment. But by the end of the trial, we'd really got a much wider distribution. The animals had moved themselves right the way up to Otterhead Lakes. So it's about 50 kilometres along the length of the river from the bottom to the top. And it just gives you an idea of how easily these animals move. You know, they're such a big animal that they're quite happy to move long distances in a river catchment and explore a whole catchment. And so by the end of the trial, we think we'd gone up from 2 family groups to around 13 families, so 13 territories. And within that, we knew we had 7 breeding pairs by March 2019. So the population was really expanding and was really thriving in the catchment. As part of that survey work, we were gathering data on which species of trees the beavers were feeding on. And as you can see from this bar chart, willow really was the predominant species that they were feeding on. Even though there's a lot of alder along the watercourse, the beavers, although they fed on it a bit, they really weren't selecting it to any great degree. But as you can see, they're feeding on pretty much anything, or can do. And what will be particularly interesting about the enclosure in Plymouth is that there isn't very much willow within the enclosure. There's a bit, but not a huge amount. So it's going to be very interesting to see which other species of tree they particularly favour. The other interesting thing to note is just how close to the water's edge the feeding takes place. So you really don't see beavers moving far from the safety of the watercourse. And most of the feeding is done either in the water, so where you've got overhanging branches, the beavers will feed on those, or within a few meters of the riverbank. And you see where you've got a nice gradual gradient, the beavers can easily get in and out of the water. That tends to be where you see some of the feeding. And on occasions, we had beavers felling trees over riverside footpaths. And again, this is one of the aspects of the trial that we were looking at, was to see what other impacts the beavers might have. And we had 3 occasions where this happened. But because this is all land that was owned by Clinton Devon Estates down in the lower part of the catchment, their team of estates workers were out quickly and were able to reopen these paths within a space of a few hours. And we had no recorded impacts on any forestry plantations at all, but we did notice that riverside orchards were particularly vulnerable. So beavers do come out of the river and they feed on windfall apples particularly. That seems to draw them out of the river, and we use apples as bait for trapping beavers. So we know that beavers are very partial to apples and carrots as well. But the beavers then also did quite like feeding on apple trees, and so part of the trial we identified where some of these most vulnerable apple trees and orchards were, and proactively protected them. And you can see here that we've got this this mesh around the base of these trees. But the other thing that beavers are probably most famous for is building dams. And we call them a keystone species because they really do engineer their habitats, and that benefits a whole range of other species. But this is probably one of the biggest dams that we had built within the River Otter catchment. You can see it's quite a significant structure, mostly made out of sticks, but a huge amount of soil as well goes into these structures. And this is how it tends to work. So this is a bit of footage from our enclosure where you've got a beaver that's fixing this this dam, and it's dredging the silt and the mud from the bottom of the pond that it's created and placing it onto the face of this dam. And what happens is that the water level gradually comes up, and where the low spot in the dam is, the beaver can detect that and will fill that with material, as you can see is happening here. And so what that does is it gradually raises the water level a bit further, and so that then pushes the water over another low spot. And so the next time the beaver's fixing that dam, it will come along and it will fix that low spot. And so gradually over time, the dams just get bigger and bigger and wider, and where you've got water spilling out of the pond around the sides, out into the floodplain, then again the beavers will create these retaining banks of earth in order to try and hold the water in. So they're constantly patrolling these areas and patching these low spots. And that's really how it works. There's not a lot of planning going on here. This is just a natural instinct, really, to stop the sound of running water. And that has a dramatic effect. So within the enclosure that we've been running since 2011, we were mapping the impacts that beavers were having on the watercourse. And at the start of the project, this is what the stream looked like. It's a really tiny first order stream, probably only 1 meter wide at the top. And actually, as it started off, it was really only almost a wet patch in a bit of woodland. And it's about 180 meters from the top of the site where the water comes in, down through the release pond that we built them, down to the culvert where the watercourse goes back under the fence. So it's really, yeah, say 200 meters between the two. And so this is what the stream looked like at the start. Within the first year, the beavers had already started building dams. So these black lines are the beaver dams. And you can see that they've already got a whole series of them all the way down the length of the watercourse. And they're also then building these canals that link up the ponds, and that allows them to move seamlessly between the ponds. So this is what the site looked like by 2012. Within another year, the dams were getting really quite large. So this top one was about 30 meters in length by this point. And you've also got a whole series of other watercourses, canals that are being dug laterally. And this allows the beavers to explore a little bit further away from the safety of the water so that they can feed on the willow that's growing in these areas. And over time, this wetland just gets more and more complex. So this is every year we come back and we map this, we map the enclosure. And so by 2017, by 2018, 2017, you've got a really complex wetland habitat, which is really quite treacherous to go into. You know, this is an incredible wetland that's been created here over the space of about 6 or 7 years, from what was really quite a narrow, uninteresting stream. Now, on the River Otter, we've been looking in a bit of detail with the University of Exeter at exactly where in the river catchment the beavers will build dams, because the reason why they build dams is to feel safe in water. That's really what it's all about. And so where they've got plenty of deep water already in the main river and in the lower reaches of the watercourse, they really don't need to build dams. And so we don't see dams in the main channel at all. But it's in the sort of headwater streams, in these blue and green areas, where the damming we anticipate is going to be most likely to happen. But the main channel itself, we really don't expect to see dams built, and that's really been borne out by our experience. And where you've got dams in the higher energy streams, maybe on the fringes of where they're viable, they're very temporary features, very dynamic. This is a dam that's been washed out, and they come and go all the time. So the beavers will rebuild them, they'll get washed out again. And so we almost, in order to try and show the extent of damming in the catchment, we had to do these snapshot surveys and say, right, okay, well, on this particular day, how many dams have we got within the catchment? And we did one of those surveys towards the end of the trial in October 2019, and we identified 28 dams across 6 of the beaver territories. So they're certainly not damming in all territories, but in some of them, you get these dams forming within the channels as well as in the surrounding fields and wetlands. What we did find was that the dams built in the lower energy watercourses, so particularly the ditches and the more heavily dredged watercourses, were more permanent structures. So they were less likely to fail, they were less likely to be eroded by the high flows. And that meant that the impacts on the surrounding land, and as you can see, this is a dam here that's been built in a ditch, and you can see that the impacts on this surrounding land are really quite significant. Again, you've got a very low gradient, so the water can spill out across quite a large area of field. And because of this low gradient, it makes the management of water levels much more difficult. So a small raise in a dam level can have really quite a dramatic impact on the surrounding land. In the natural streams, where you've got these much more dynamic dams, the coming and going of these dams actually creates a whole range of habitats. So this is actually a before and after photo. You can just make out the tree stump here that sticks out on both images, and this is where the dam was fairly new. Actually, it was fairly early on in the project. So about 2016, I think this photograph was taken. But by 2018, you can see this dam has completely gone. But you've got this lovely new gravel area, which has been created by the washing out of the dam, and all the sediment that was trapped behind the dam gets washed down. But all of the larger pebbles and gravels that also got trapped behind the dam then get redistributed. And you get these lovely new riffles forming, and these are fantastic spawning habitats for fish. And one of the things that we've done quite a lot of work on the River Otter was understanding the impacts of these features on fish populations. So we've had specialists from the University of Southampton studying the impacts in a lot of detail using electrofishing, which is a way of attracting fish to a net using electricity, which stuns them temporarily, and it means that you can count them and measure them. And it's allowed us to really identify over the course of the trial how the different fish populations within that reach have been impacted. And as you'd expect, in the deeper pools, particularly those behind beaver dams, you get more big fish. You also get lots of minnows, so the biomass of fish is higher as well. But in the new gravel beds created by dams washing out, that's where you tend to get your young trout. So that's where the spawning grounds for young trout are. So you get lots of fry in those areas. And they're also then good for species like bullheads and stone loach. The other thing we were looking at, not in a lot of detail because we didn't have very many opportunities, but we were able to see trout actually leaping these dams. So in low flows, when the stream was hardly flowing at all, these dams are potentially a barrier to fish passage. So particularly larger fish like sea trout, can't get up them if there's no flow coming over them. But as soon as you get these autumn rains, then the trout are able to get up and over the dams, and we were able to get some really nice video of. In fact, you can see this trout here, quite a good sized sea trout, leaping up over this dam, and so we were able to show that beavers were able to pass these structures. Now back to the enclosure. This is another aspect of the beaver damming that we've been really interested in. So this is the enclosure, and you can see the sequence of dams that's been built. We've been studying with the University of Exeter how the series of dams impacts the amount of water coming downstream. So we've had these measuring devices at the top and the bottom of the site. So where these stars are, these red stars, we have a V notch. and that measures the flow coming in and leaving the site. So this blue line on the graph shows how much water is coming into the top of the site after heavy rain. So these little bars at the top here, this is heavy rainfall, and after heavy rain you get this lovely big flood peak coming in at the top of the site. But by the time that flood peak has moved down through the sequence of ponds and is measured again at the bottom, you can see that the flood peak has been quite seriously reduced and flattened. It's all about flattening the curve again. And as well as that, as well as the high flows being reduced, in low flows, you've got more water being released at the bottom of the site than you've got coming in at the top. So even during droughts, you've got water gradually being released into this stream, which again is benefiting the fish and the invertebrates that live in this bit of watercourse. And on the River Otter, the University of Exeter have been studying this in a lot of detail. So we've got a community at risk of flooding here. This is down in the lower part of the river catchment, and we've got a beaver created wetland here. And the watercourse runs down through here and into this community that floods. And we're lucky that we've got an Environment Agency gauging station just about here, just before you get into the village. And that's got a lot of long-term data, which shows how the community floods and how much water is coming down this watercourse and going through this village. And each of these dots on the graph is a flood event. And you can see the red line is the line drawn through these flood events before the beavers turned up. But after the beavers turned up, you can see that the line drawn through these flood events is lower. And so the effect of this wetland and the beaver dams in slowing the flow of water reaching this community means that the peak flows are reduced, and that obviously benefits the people that are at risk of flooding in this village. Now, this is another thing that the University of Exeter have been studying or have been looking at. I'll let this play. These days, drones are used for just about everything, and ecological survey work and mapping is no exception. So this is the drone that's going up, and it's allowing us to produce a really nice 3D image of what the site looks like. And this is one of the beaver sites on the top of the River Otter. In fact, you can just about make out the stream that runs down the side of the site here. And so you've got this lovely big wetland adjacent to the stream. And the drone was able to generate this this model which shows the extent of beaver feeding, and the red areas are where the beavers have been clearing the willow and pushing the willow back, and this has had a real beneficial effect on the wetland habitat here, which is a county wildlife site, really important for a whole range of open habitats. And one of the issues with this type of habitat is scrub encroachment, and willow in particular. And so this has been really interesting to see how effective the beavers have been at pushing the willow back and reopening the open habitats. And that obviously has a huge impact on other things. So we call them this keystone species because of the benefits on other species. And amphibians are a really good example of that. We've been monitoring frog spawn or frog populations in our enclosure since 2011. And right at the start, we had 10 clumps of frog spawn in the site because, you know, there was nowhere for the frogs to breed. You know, there was just no open water really to speak of. You know, you saw that map at the beginning of the project, but over the course of the project, the population increased and increased and increased, and by the 2017 survey, we had 681 clumps of frog spawn counted. And frogs are the bottom of the food chain; everything eats them. So the herons were coming in, we've got grass snakes coming in, all sorts of things that are reliant on that important source of food. Another question that gets asked quite frequently is, what's the interaction like between beavers and otters? And as you can see, this is an example of an interaction between beavers and otters. It's not always like that. Most of the time, beavers and otters get along really well with each other. the beavers are building burrows, and the otters are frequently using those burrows as laying up places and halts, because otters can't build their own burrow sites. I mean, look, she's coming back now. I'm going to play that again, actually, because it's such a nice little bit of footage. But the other thing, obviously, that beavers are doing is creating these habitats. And so this pond was created by beavers, and the otters have been using it and have been feeding in it. And what we think is happening here is that the beavers have got youngsters, they've got kits. And we do think that otters will probably predate young beaver kits if they can. And so in the spring, summertime, when the kits are still young, we do see the adult beavers being much more defensive towards otters. And that's what you've just seen there, the female beaver driving off the otter, protecting its kits. Now, the impact of all this extra water is great for wetland habitats, but it does have impacts on agriculture. And on 5 of the sites within the River Otter catchment, we did see impacts on low-lying agricultural land. And we also detected feeding on maize. So where you've got maize being planted really close to watercourses where the beavers are living, then the beavers do come out and feed on that. So again, it's a good reason to give the watercourse a bit of space and not plant too close to the edge of the river. So we saw that in 3 occasions. And one of the conclusions of the trial is that it really is essential that good quality, pragmatic advice and support is available to landowners and anybody that's living and farming on the edge of the watercourse. And there's a whole range of practical interventions that can be deployed where there is a risk of beaver activity impacting on infrastructure or on agriculture. So these are examples. This is a beaver deceiver going in here, a flow device. We're able to protect a tree here with a bit of wire mesh. This tree has been painted with a sandy paint mix, which again deters beaver feeding. And another conclusion that we made is that financial support is really going to be essential for land and property owners to reward them for allowing the beavers to create these wetland habitats. You know, if we're looking for landowners to store water to reduce flooding for people that live downstream, then providing them with financial support is going to be really important in order to persuade them to do that. And buffer strips are the best way of starting with that. Buffer strips not only reduce conflicts with agriculture, so by stepping the agricultural activities back away from the watercourse by a few meters, you're giving the stream a bit more space. It allows the natural processes to move the stream if necessary. It provides these water quality and water storage benefits. So you can see again, you've got a dam across an old stream here. Well, if this was all agricultural land right the way up to the water's edge, then you wouldn't be getting any of these benefits. And you can see one of the other benefits of this is that this is a fish bypass channel now. So any fish coming up here can easily get round this dam because this watercourse has got a bit more space. And another critical thing is myth busting and information provision. There's a lot of misinformation about beavers and what they do and what they feed on. And so actually providing accurate information is really important as part of any reintroduction project. But the support is overwhelming. You know, 90% of people support beaver reintroduction. It's a really positive story, and I think we've shown really effectively on the Otter that we can maximise these positive benefits, but also manage any of the conflicts that they do bring. And there are now, as a result, beaver populations and projects springing up in other parts of the country. So there's license applications for enclosures in all parts of the country now, and also a number of other wild populations. So particularly in Kent here, we've got a lot of beavers living on the Stour. We've also got them living on the Tamar, so living wild in the Tamar. I should say they haven't come from our enclosure, but they have been escaping, by the sounds of it, from a landowner who's got beavers within the catchment. But also populations up on the Wye and on the Dovey in Wales as well. And this winter, we're anticipating that DEFRA will launch a consultation on the future of beavers. They've already made the decision that the ones on the River Otter can stay, but they have to decide what the legal status of beavers will be across the country. They've already decided in Scotland that the beaver is a native resident species again and is given full legal protection. So those are the decisions that they have to make here in England now. They're also going to decide whether beavers will be allowed to be released elsewhere into the wild or whether they will need to stay within fences. What will happen to the other wild populations, like on the Tamar and on the Stour, and also will resources be made available to support the landowners and the management that's going to be required over the course of any reintroduction. And that's pretty much the end of my talk. So a quick thank you to all of the people that have supported the River Otter beaver trial. We had no government funding at all during the course of the trial itself, although we do have some DEFRA money coming in to continue the management interventions at the moment until they make the final decision about the legal status over the course of the next year. So I think that's probably it for me. I'll hand back to Chris. Right, try to do that.
Apologies, I pressed the unmute button. Thank you, Mark, for the presentation. Fantastic amount of energy and has gone into the work that you've been doing on this project. So it's great to see that coming to life there in that presentation. We've had a whole range of questions coming through on the Q&A, which is great to see. I'm just going to pick out some of these and go through them. So a question for Mark, and this is a question from Chris. It's a question around the behaviour of the beaver families themselves. So the question is, do the beavers stay together as a family group, or do the kids head off to create their own lodges?
Yeah, the answer to that is that they will stay in the family group for 2 years, but they often do have a number of burrows or lodges within that territory, so they're not all necessarily living together in the same burrow for that whole 2-year period. But after 2 years, they are then driven off and have to go and find their own way in the world. So they will find another beaver of the opposite sex, and they will set up their own territory and build their own lodge.
Great, thank you. And there was a question which came in, which is from Chris, which I think is an interesting one, which I can pick up on. The question was, how was the overall response been to the reintroduction of beavers in the urban Plymouth catchment? And how has Devon Wildlife Trust and Plymouth City Council been able to manage differing views? So in terms of the public perception, we completed a pre-introduction survey with the University of Exeter across the city, and it was overwhelmingly positive. People were really enthusiastic about the introduction of this the species into the city. The concerns which were raised as part of that consultation were around the welfare of the beavers themselves, which we've been looking to address through the site set up to ensure that we've got robust enclosure fencing and we've got monitoring of the area. So that's been really fantastic. And how have we managed to be able to manage the differing views? I think that's been about continuing conversations with people, whether that's through people with particular interest groups. That may be, for example, the Devon Badger Group, who've been involved with us in looking at how we balance the needs of different wildlife species within the enclosure area, and also having strong involvement from our volunteer groups who do work on the project at Poole Farm, which they've been a key part of developing this project and getting it set up. So that's been it's been a really positive response to that. I just want to pick up on some of the questions which related to the I think interesting thing about the Plymouth project is around the urban sort of context of the beaver introduction in Plymouth. So a question for Mark initially, which is about what we can learn from other parts of Europe. So the question was, it's really exciting that Plymouth will be the first UK city to have beavers, but are there examples of urban beaver reintroductions in other cities across Europe, and what can we learn from these?
There are certainly beavers living wild in other cities. So Munich, for example, has quite a lot of beavers living on the river there. And I think, I mean, beavers and people can live alongside each other in cities quite easily, as long as there's enough space. What you don't want are beaver dams being built in small urban streams, which are important drainage routes. So that's one, you know, they will require management if they're living wild within an urban area like that. Clearly, here in Plymouth, they're living within a fence, and so any of those issues are immediately eliminated. But yeah, beavers do quite happily live alongside people. And they really, you know, they if there's deep water and if you've got a bigger river running through an urban area, then the beavers can live alongside people really without almost, you know, people don't even know that they're there a lot of the time. They're really not having a very significant impact. You know, you might see the occasional willow tree alongside the river being fed upon. Some of the bigger trees, some of the more important things like weeping willow trees that have got cultural value, might need to be protected from beaver feeding. Otherwise, everybody wakes up in the morning and finds that one of their most valued trees is down in the river. But those are the sort of things that can easily be managed.
Great, thanks, Mark. And that leads on to a question which is then posed around the challenges. So what the question was, again from an anonymous, what sort of challenges will the urban beaver reintroduction have compared to projects taking place in rural areas? Jerry, can I bring you in to provide a bit of a response on
that? Yeah, hi Chris, hi everyone. So yeah, I mean, an urban reintroduction does pose some challenges. Obviously, there's a lot more people around, and that means interactions with the creatures. So we've been quite careful to build a really sturdy enclosure that's about 1.4 meters high, and it should keep most people out, but importantly keep beavers in too. Some of the other challenges we face is, you know, the catchment and the river has had decades worth of sort of rubbish accumulate that's washed down the river, and we've had our fantastic team of volunteers out collecting some of the debris and clearing it out of the enclosure to make sure it's safe for the beavers. So, you know, the sort of things we came across, we've had shopping trolleys and road cones, as you'd imagine, lots and lots of barbed wire. We had 2 children's bikes and 3 or 4 motorbikes, so there's quite a bit of trash we've had to clear, and considering it's a very beautiful wooded catchment, that's quite surprising. So there's some issues we've had to work around, but actually the benefit of having an urban reintroduction where people live means we've got a lot of people interested in it, and a lot of volunteers who want to come and help and help keep an eye on the beavers and check the fence lines for us. So it brings challenges and opportunities.
Thank you, Jerry. Yes, I think I'd echo that. I think there's some really interesting learning which you can have in the Plymouth project. I think particularly around some of the built infrastructure we've got in the city, in and around the catchment area. So, you know, where we've got manipulated kind of flows of water coming into the channel, we're not working with a wholly natural sort of hydrology within the catchment. So that's going to be really interesting for us to kind of look at how we monitor that and how we kind of learn from how that works, and the beavers' response to that as well, which will be interesting. So I'm just going to go to the next question. Mark, it's a question for you around, I think you mentioned this in the presentation, but it's around how we record the data, the biology of the beavers. So how do we track them? So using GPS location or radio tags, and what methods have you employed to do this? And are there any other technologies which are on the horizon which might be useful?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's one that we've really struggled with actually on the River Otter, because they're an aquatic animal. They spend a lot of time underwater. They live in burrows. They're living underground a lot of the time. They mutually groom each other. So any animal that's wearing any sort of device, any sort of collar, any sort of harness or anything like that, you know, would be groomed out by the other beavers quite rapidly. you have to be really very careful if you're doing any sort of radio tracking about the welfare of the animals. And so we decided on the River Otter that because we didn't need to as part of any license condition, we wouldn't monitor the actual animals themselves other than through ear tags. So they have a little ear tag which identifies individuals, and then pit tags. So these are the things that cats and dogs have, like a little microchip underneath the skin. So it just means that we can, if we trap an animal, we can scan it and we can be sure which animal it is. But actually radio tracking animals is almost impossible with beavers. They have done a little bit in Norway where they glue a really quite a big transmitter onto the back of the beaver. And the beaver just doesn't like them at all. They don't last for very long. They last for a few weeks before they fall off. And because we weren't required to do that, we didn't do that on the River Otter. And I think there's not really any need for it. Certainly what we've been able to do is by using completely non-intervention techniques of looking at field signs, we've got a pretty good data set of where they're living and how they're behaving without any welfare implications on the beavers at all. So yeah, it's a much beaver friendlier way of doing it.
Great, thank you, Mark. And yeah, we are working in Plymouth on the project here to look at ways and means of understanding the movement of the beavers within the territory when they're introduced. And part of the Green Minds project, one of the strengths of this is we've got a wide partnership group. So we are working with the partners to look at options and how we can use look at some ways of understanding how the beavers set up and introduce themselves into the habitat they're being introduced into. A nice question here, Mark, just a quick one for you. I think it's just picking up maybe some of the personal side of things for your point of view. But the question is simply, what are your highlights from working on these beaver projects?
I think the highlights for me have just been back in 2011, when we first put the beavers into the enclosure, it was seeing how quickly they got to work on the watercourse. I don't think anybody really, we were sort of originally looking to try and use beavers to restore grassland habitats. We wanted to see the impact that beavers had on this grassland habitat. And yet within the space of a few months, they'd already built this incredible network of dams and canals. And the canals were incredible structures, really quickly dredged out. So that was really exciting. And I remember that back in 2011 being really quite excited by that. And then I think probably more recently, it's actually seeing the effects that the dams have had on these streams in the headwaters of the Otter. As these dams come and go, they bring the river back to life. Where you've got rivers that have been quite heavily managed over time by people, they've been dredged and deepened. The beavers are really restoring the whole natural function of these watercourses, and that for me that's been one of the most exciting aspects of it.
Fantastic, thank you. A question here, which I think I can talk about in the first instance. Mark, maybe you have something to come in on around this as well. The question is from Anna. It says, hello, is the Southwest setting a precedent for the rest of the country to show that there are more cost-effective and sustainable methods of flood prevention than hard engineering? I think the answer to the question is yes. I think that is clearly, within the Southwest, with the work the Devon Wildlife Trust have done with the University of Exeter and many other agencies and organisations involved, we're really showing and pushing the boundaries really of applying nature-based solutions in the natural environment. So looking at some of the issues which we are faced with in society and how do we manage those most effectively. And that's been one of the real drivers behind the Plymouth project. Is we're living in a catchment which is quite markedly being altered for different reasons. Plymouth is a growing city, and there's a recognition within sort of policy within the city that as the city grows, we need to manage our infrastructure, whether that's built infrastructure or natural infrastructure, in a way which is most sustainable. And part of that and part of this project is about understanding the value of nature-based solutions. So in the catchment where the beavers are being introduced, there's a range of different flood prevention schemes and interventions being put in place, and that could be the introduction of attenuation basins for nearby housing developments, culverts under new road schemes, so there's a range of different interventions being put in place, and the beavers being another one. So this project is giving us a fantastic opportunity to really look at and compare and contrast the viability of a nature-based solution versus harder engineering solutions. So that's certainly one of the key aspects of the project which we'll be monitoring throughout it. Mark, I don't know if you had anything else to say on that point in terms of the flooding question.
Yeah, I mean, this is where the University of Exeter's expertise has been brilliant. So they sort of started the work in the enclosure in 2013, and that was the first time they'd done any work on the hydrology. But what they've been able to do since then is to scale that up. So they've been involved with almost all of the other beaver projects around the country now, looking at different types and sizes of watercourse, and Plymouth's obviously not going to be is no exception. You know, they'll be able to see how beaver dams affect different types of watercourse, and as they start to get that bigger picture, they can then build a catchment scale model and properly understand what, if you have beavers throughout a big river catchment and they're all building dams in all of these headwater streams, what does that do to the main flow of the main river? And you know, we're a long way off that yet. Well, I say a long way. We are not there yet, and so we need more sites and more modelling to really understand how it can work at that scale. Because then you could start looking at flood risk to London, to Gloucester. You know, you can look at the bigger urban areas that are at risk of flooding, and if you superimpose beaver dams across the whole of those headwater streams, you could really see quite a dramatic effect. But we're not there yet.
Great, thank you. A couple more questions. I think we've got time for a couple more before we reach the end of the hour. So a question here, Mark, for you around trees. That's been one of the issues which has been raised in Plymouth as well. But are there any? The question is, are there any drawbacks in terms of the beavers removing trees, for example, animal habitats or root structure preventing erosion?
Probably not so much from an erosion point of view, because what they're tending to do is coppice trees. So they're often reducing the height of the canopy. So particularly for species like willow and poplar, which can actually be really quite tall trees and can overhang, if a tree is felled, then almost in all cases it will coppice. And so that actually makes it a more stable structure in terms of riverbank. But they do obviously have an impact on the tree structure. And if you've got trees that are important culturally or from a landscape point of view, then they will change that landscape over time. And so it's important to identify which trees are important and to proactively protect them if necessary. You know, and that's the good thing about, you know, what we've learned from other parts of the world where people and beavers are living alongside each other. You know, they routinely protect some of their most important riverside poplar trees, for example. And that's definitely something that we'll have to learn to do as we learn to relive alongside this species.
Great, thanks, Mark. So final question. I'm just been trying to keep up with some of the questions that have come in as we've gone through here. Obviously we've not been able to cover them all in this session, but the final one I've picked up here is around pollution. So obviously within the Plymouth area, we've got a manipulated catchment here, and there are inputs into the catchment. We've done monitoring ahead of the beaver reintroduction in terms of monitoring water quality, sorry. But Mark, do you have any insights of anything you've had to pick up on how pollution will impact on beavers?
The good thing about beavers not being at the top of the food chain is that they're not accumulating pollutants. So where, you know, species like otters have always been at risk of bioaccumulating pollutants because they're feeding on lots of eels and fish, for example, and so all of the pollutants, the heavy metals that are in the tissue of those animals then get accumulated by the predator. Beavers, obviously, that doesn't apply to. So, and they do seem to be able to cope with pretty poor water quality. They don't seem to have too many adverse effects of silt. You know, they're obviously in silt a lot of the time. They're moving mud around, and that doesn't seem to affect them at all. we had a death of a beaver within our enclosure in 2013, and we don't know what caused that, but there was a possibility that it was as a result of a pathogen of some description that had come down with a slurry slick that had come down into the enclosure, but we don't know for sure. So I think generally they seem to cope really well with low water quality, and certainly sediment and silt is something that they, you know, that's their bread and butter really. That's what they use for building the dams, so it's all good.
Fantastic. It's good to hear that, yeah, beavers have bread and butter as well, so in part of their diet. Fantastic. Okay, well, thank you everybody. We've reached coming to the end of our hour's webinar here, so I just want to do a final wrap up. We will look at the questions we have been able to answer and pick those up at the end of the webinar. I just want to say a final thank you to Mark for his presentation today and bringing forward all of the expertise and knowledge that the Devon Beaver Project has. Thank you to everyone in the audience who's attended today. It's been fantastic, and there's been a whole multitude of questions coming in. It's been great to see the range of questions coming through. We will be sharing a short survey from on the back of this event, and also the webinar recording will be going out there, so you can catch up on it afterwards or share that with people who haven't been able to attend this morning. Quite a few questions in there around how to get involved. So at the end of the webinar here, we'll be putting a slide on the screen which will have future Green Minds events and webinars which you can link into, but also contacts for how you can stay involved with the Green Minds project, and particularly the Beaver project in Plymouth, and get in contact with us if you're keen to be involved in any aspect of the project. So do hang on and take down the details at the end of the webinar. Please, yes, do get in touch. Do sign up for more of the events if you're able to. There's more to come this week. And just, yeah, I'd say final thank you and thanks for attending, and goodbye.